What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this episode of Hidden Forces is geopolitical analyst and forecaster Kamran Bokhari. Kamran is the Senior Director of the Eurasian Security and Prosperity Portfolio at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy, and has served at the U.S. State Department and as a senior consultant with the World Bank. Kamran came on the show 3 months ago to discuss the violence ignited by Hamas's October 7th attacks against Israel and the nature and scope of Iran's involvement. I asked him back on the podcast to re-examine how the war in Gaza is going and whether he still thinks that we could be headed for another major war in the Middle East. We spent the first hour of the podcast discussing the Israeli bombardment and offensive in Gaza, the strategic objectives of Israel's leaders, whether they're achieving those objectives, the standing of Netanyahu and his governing coalition, the future of Israeli politics, and whether any hope remains for a negotiated peace process that could eventually lead to a viable and independent Palestinian state, given the scale and scope of the current destruction. In the second hour, we broaden our focus to encompass the larger Middle East, including Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the Houthis, and Hezbollah, and how all of these different actors are repositioning themselves and in many cases exploiting the growing disorder as the Biden administration struggles to stabilize a region that may be on the verge of another major war. If you want access to that part of the conversation and you're not already subscribed to Hidden Forces, you can join our premium feed and listen to the second hour of today's episode by going to hiddenforces.io/subscribe. All of our content tiers give you access to our premium feed, which you can listen to on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, access to special research and analysis, in-person events, and dinners, you can also do that on our subscriber page. And if you still have questions, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. And with that, please enjoy this exceptionally informative, important, and timely conversation with my guest, Kamran Bokhari. Kamran Bokhari, welcome back to Hidden Forces. Back so soon.
Thank you, Demetri. Thank you for having me back.
I'm pretty sure the only other person that's been back faster than you is Demetri Alperovitch, and that's because he came on in December of 2021 for an episode titled Why Putin Plans to Invade Ukraine, and then Putin invaded Ukraine in February, so we had him back within 2 months. But you're back within, the last time you were on the show was 3 months ago, was just after the October 7th attacks. The Israelis have since flattened huge swaths of Gaza, primarily in the north. According to a recent article in the Wall Street Journal, the IDF has dropped 29,000 bombs, munitions, and shells, including hundreds of 2,000-pound bombs, which create impact craters 40 feet in diameter and are capable of killing people or wounding people within 1,000 feet from the explosion. According to another investigation, this one by the New York Times, these bombs have also been used at least 200 times in areas deemed safe for civilians. Nearly 70% of Gaza's 439 homes and about half of its buildings have been damaged or destroyed. Before we get into a conversation about the bigger picture, including Iran's involvement and the threat of further escalation by groups like the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Shia militias in Iraq, to say nothing about Hamas, all of which have ties to Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, what do we know and what can you tell us about what has happened in Gaza since the war first broke out, and how is that war going for the Israelis?
Well, Demetri, you've already laid out the scale of the destruction with concrete numbers. So I'm going to try to make sense of it. So we don't have any indication of just how much the target, the actual target of these attacks, has been damaged. I'm talking about Hamas. We've heard very little about elimination of top leadership. Probably the highest ranking leader of Hamas was actually killed yesterday, and that was in Beirut in an airstrike. To what extent the Gaza-based leadership has been decimated, to what extent Hamas's fighting capabilities have been decimated is really, really unclear. We don't have anything definitive from the Israelis themselves. We do know that they are still combing through this maze of tunnels. And again, we know very little about how much of that tunnel system has been compromised. To what extent is Hamas on the defensive? So if that is all of that is true, and then you pair that up against the scale of civilian devastation, the number of people killed, wounded, displaced, the number of buildings, basically flattened, and the number of lives and the economic deprivation that is taking place, then you begin to ask, questions about how this war is actually going. And then, of course, I'll add in the consistent messaging from Israeli leadership saying, we need more time and this war is not about to end anytime soon. We will continue and fight to the end. So, if you add all of that up and you say, well, there's a whole lot of damage you've done in terms of, collateral damage that has real ramifications for destabilizing the region, Iran, and anybody who's opposed to the Israelis and is supporting Hamas, or anybody else, who just feels for the Palestinians. Those people have been alienated and energized. And that puts a lot of pressure internationally on not just Israel, but Israel's main ally, the United States. And we're seeing that. We're seeing sort of this disconnect taking place or unfolding between the Biden White House and the Netanyahu government. So, you have to say that so far, we're not seeing any sort of concrete evidence that the military goals of this war have been realized. In fact, I would say, and I'm not the only one, there are many people very thoughtful on all sides of this conflict who've come out and basically said that the stated goal is something that was wrong to begin with. They said, we'll destroy Hamas. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean, to me, and I think you and I discussed this last time, is I translate that as sort of, that's political rhetoric. And if it's really translated in pure kinetic terms, then it means two things. One is degrading the offensive capabilities of Hamas and effecting regime change. In other words, making it very, very difficult, almost impossible for Hamas to run Gaza, once this conflict is over. I'm not seeing concrete evidence. I'm not saying there is no evidence, but I'm saying it's not enough to say that Israel has delivered a decisive blow to Hamas. The leaders are still out there. The hostages are still unaccounted for. And so there's a lot of uncertainty. And I'm not sure we can call that, progress, just given the amount of time that has gone by, the time elapsed, and the time that the Israelis are asking for. And if you notice, just yesterday, and I'm still sort of trying to process this, and I'm not really clear about it, but there are two things that caught my eye. One is the announcement from Israel that they're pulling 5 brigades out of Gaza. And that was seen as a sign that they're probably reducing the tempo of operations. So that's one part of it. So that you see that even there's some form of recognition or acknowledgement, however implicit, that they are not going to achieve. You don't pull these forces out. In fact, if you haven't succeeded, then you need more forces to go in and say, okay, if it's not working with X amount of troops, then we put in new. If we're operating under the assumption that this is going to go on for a while. And then the second one was the announcement from the U.S. Navy that the carrier strike group, the USS Ford, is coming home to Norfolk, Virginia. It was in the Eastern Med. So these two developments from the last 48 hours and, all signs taken together, do not paint a picture of, if you will, substantial progress on the part of the Israelis.
But, okay, so let's just stick with that for a second. Doesn't that suggest that maybe Washington thinks the situation might be stabilizing if they pull the USS Ford out of the Mediterranean?
I think that it could be interpreted that way, that the thought did cross my mind. But then we're also seeing tensions with Hezbollah rising. You had a speech from Nasrallah today in the aftermath of the airstrike that took out the deputy Hamas leader very close to the Hezbollah headquarters in downtown Beirut, in the Lebanese capital. You have another speech, apparently, that he's going to give on Friday. There are reports of the Israelis wanting to basically push Hezbollah forces out of South Lebanon. In other words, from the border with Israel all the way north to the Litani River. And the idea is that, United Nations forces as well as Lebanese armed forces would fill the vacuum that would be, in theory, vacated by or created by Hezbollah forces, either withdrawing or being pushed militarily. So it's not really clear. But the fact that Washington and the Pentagon decided that, hey, we're bringing the Ford back home, it could be that it might be replaced by another carrier strike group because, you need to do the rotation. There's only so much time that one particular carrier strike group can be, deployed before it needs maintenance and, rest and whatnot. So it's not really clear to me that the situation is in the clear, if you will, or I can't sort of breathe lightly that this is a sign of de-escalation, if you will.
So I've been in touch with a number of people in Israel since the attacks. One, it's just you can feel when you speak to Israelis that it was a traumatic experience. And one of the things that people share with me often is these tunnels, videos from these tunnels. A friend recently shared one with me that supposedly was a tunnel dug from Gaza all the way out into the West Bank. It seems that public opinion has become more radicalized since those attacks and more pessimistic about the ability to achieve peace through a two-state solution, and also that this issue needs to be resolved once and for all now, and that now is the time that Israel has to do that. What do we know about public opinion in Israel right now? And does that sentiment, if it's accurate, suggest that maybe there's a greater willingness on the part of the Israelis to engage Hezbollah in the north because they don't want to continue living under that threat, and now is the time to engage them?
I think public opinion is not straightforward in Israel. So there is the public opinion that you just mentioned, and which is understandable fully given the unexpected, attack on October 7th that was horrendous. The scale of carnage was much bigger than what Israel had seen in a long time. And so on one hand, there is that idea that, hey, forget about peace right now. We need to worry about our security. And obviously, this feeds into sort of the narratives on the right and the hard right in Israel at a time when the left is very weak, as I explained back when we spoke in October. So there is that sort of public opinion. But then there is a public opinion that is against the current prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. I saw a poll yesterday, or a report about a poll yesterday, that says only 15% of all Israelis want Benjamin Netanyahu to continue in office. That's pretty staggering. And what do you do about the root cause, this long-standing conflict with the Palestinians that has not seen any resolution, that has basically allowed for the radicalization of the Palestinian landscape? You and I talked about how the Palestinian landscape, is radicalized because Hamas has the upper hand, and the mainstream Fatah group, which dominates the internationally recognized Palestinian Authority, is very weak and incoherent, divided internally, and facing a leadership transition. So there are a lot of Israelis, I hear from a lot of Israelis myself, and that there is that question. Okay, so is this purely solvable militarily? Well, if you ask people from the far right and many elements of, not so far right, you'll say, hey, yes, if you basically remove Hamas from ruling Gaza. And then there is the debate of who comes in and rules. There is a view that says, we can't trust the Palestinian Authority because they haven't condemned October 7th. And so they're not any better than Hamas.
Does the Palestinian Authority even have the legitimacy to govern Gaza?
There is that as well. So, there is that problem of legitimacy, which is a Palestinian problem. But from an Israeli sort of public opinion point of view, you have the view that we have to come up with a better solution. Some people say, well, there has to be an Israeli occupation.
Is there any interest among the Arab states, in particular Saudi Arabia, to have some kind of involvement? Because this was a solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, some kind of peace resolution, was part of the larger deal that was underway between Israel, the United States, and Saudi Arabia prior to the October 7th attacks. So is there any speculation that those conversations could restart and that Saudi Arabia could play some constructive role in the area?
Yes, but the question is what kind of role? So there are many roles to be played. So there's a need for investments. That's something, that's right up the alley of the Saudis. They have the money to invest should they decide. But they are not just about to drop lots of cash into something that they don't see as reliable. They need to be able to see that their money isn't just being dropped into a black hole and then they'll, 6 months, a year down the line, they're going to be at the same point where they are right now. So yes, there's a role for them. But then there's a role of getting, the Palestinian factions to come together. Fatah has openly said, the prime minister of the Palestinian Authority has openly said, Hamas, whatever will remain of Hamas after, the day after this conflict ends, will somehow need to be brought in to whatever political dispensation emerges. Who does that? The Saudis have only so much influence. The Arab states already have sort of a weird, I don't want to call it a division of labor, but there's a weird shared responsibility, if you will. The Egyptians have some influence. The Qataris have some influence. The Jordanians have some influence. The Saudis have some influence. The UAE has some influence. So it isn't just the Saudis.
Right. The Qataris have a lot of influence, right? And by design, in some sense. They've been allowed to have as much influence as they do.
They do, yeah. And of course, Turkey has influence, although it's not an Arab state, and it remains to be seen what role it will play.
But can Hamas really play a constructive? Do they want to play a constructive role?
I don't think so. I think that Hamas would have to substantively change its nature in order to be able to do that. And I don't think that it's in Hamas to be able to do that, make that kind of transition. It is what it is. And I think that while any movement has its pragmatists and its hardline ideologues and everybody else in between, it's kind of like asking, the Taliban to allow women to have education. They're not going to do that. So, the world is trying to work around that problem. And so Hamas at the end of the day knows one thing, that it has a good chance of dominating the political landscape of the Palestinians, even after the devastation. It's the military devastation. It remains to be seen. I haven't seen any polls yet, but there is talk that there's been some increase in Hamas's popularity since the war began.
Really?
I've seen some talk of this. These are unreliable reports, and I haven't seen any scientific data to back that up. But what I do have is the Arab Barometer that Professor Amani Jamal from Princeton and her group put together just one day before the October 7th attack. And that showed that Hamas was very, very unpopular amongst Gazans. And so if somehow Hamas's popularity has increased, the question is where? Is it in Gaza? Well, I don't know who has taken a poll of Gazans. Those poor people are suffering. Are they even ready to, fill out surveys and deal with interviewers? Or is this sort of like a popularity at the regional level or in the West Bank amongst diaspora communities? We don't know. But the fact is that Hamas is not going away anywhere. And Hamas's leadership, the political leadership, will, let's play a hypothetical out. Let's say Israel is at some point over the next few weeks or months able to impose a military defeat on Hamas in Gaza. And there is some sort of a negotiated surrender with the understanding that certain people will be playing a role somehow in the new dispensation, however minor it might be. They may not dominate the future political authority or ruling structure, but they do. What does that mean? What can we expect from them? From a Hamas's point of view, that's sort of the bridge from the war to eventually becoming a major player, because there's Hamas also in the West Bank. There is Hamas in Qatar, in Turkey, the overseas leadership. They would want to cash in on this. And you see reports in mainstream media of disconnect between the overseas leadership and the Gaza-based leadership because of obviously the differing interests. Those inside the Strip want to survive, and they want to survive this war, whereas the political leadership sitting outside also wants its people to survive inside the Strip. But at the end of the day, regardless of who survives or not inside the Strip, they want to be able to reap the political dividends from whatever comes out of the war. And there's talk of, having Hamas join the PLO as a way to, mainstream it, quote unquote. But yeah, you're right. Hamas is not about to change. It cannot be completely eliminated. The opposing side is saying, well, we'll need to work with Hamas. What do they mean by that? What does that look like? We don't know. So the bottom line is that this problem isn't going away. And then the question is, how do you bring normalcy back to, Hamas is a group with finite number of members. There's far more people in Gaza who are just, your average citizen, average Palestinian. Their lives have been upended. So who's going to rebuild Gaza? There's going to be a lot of infrastructure redevelopment, basic, services, water, sanitation, electrical connections, and so on and so forth, medical aid. Who does that? And, that is the big question. The Palestinian Authority alone cannot do it, even if it is parachuted in. The money from the Arab Gulf states alone will not do it. This will require a heavy lift from multiple actors. And I wrote a piece a few weeks back talking about how Egypt would have to, as far as Gaza is concerned, Egypt would have to do the heavy lifting because of proximity. And Egypt ruled this territory for about 20 years, and they've kept close eye on it and close relations. So they're going to pick up a lot of that. And then, of course, how do you create that unity of government that is being talked about between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, knowing that these two are literally, separated physically from each other? And how do you create that unity of government that brings the Jordanians in as well, who have a lot of influence and say in what happens in the West Bank, at least amongst the Palestinians? So we're still far away from any semblance of saying that, hey, we're leaving the war behind and we're moving into a sort of a post-conflict scenario. I think we're still very far from the post-conflict scenario.
And we haven't even touched on Israeli politics. What does Israeli politics look like coming out of this, and what kind of governing coalition would be needed in order to restart some kind of peace process, which raises the awkward question of Netanyahu and his political future. What is his situation? His approval ratings continue to fall based on some of the latest surveys I've seen. More than half of Israelis want him to resign. How is he navigating this political crisis? Do you think he holds out any hope that he might still stay in power? And how much of his decision-making is informed by that hope? And how is he navigating his relationship with the United States and Joe Biden right now? I mean, what do we know about that?
So two very good questions. The first one is, look, he's been in power longer than any other Israeli prime minister. When you've been at it that long and you have that kind of legacy, you don't want to give it up anytime soon. And if the conflict has provided pathways for you to actually stay in power, or at least perceived pathways, then you'll go after them. You'll follow that pathway until you realize that you can't push further. And then the next thing is that how do you avoid all the, if you will, negativity, for lack of a better term, and all the legal troubles that will come when you leave office.
He needs to get to a Nixon moment, a point of resignation in order to save his own skin and forfeit every other thing he had hoped for.
Yeah, and in other places that are, have semi-democracies or semi-autocracies, depending on how you're looking at them, the incumbent who's being forced to step down has a lot of wiggle room and negotiates and says, hey, A, I don't want to be prosecuted. B, I don't want people coming after me financially. And, I need some guarantees, some indemnities. And I don't think that, considering that Israel is a democracy and in the light of the Supreme Court decision from the other day, I don't think that Netanyahu is going to be able to get that advantage. I think he's facing troubles. And the last thing that he wants is to be remembered and, not just remembered or live a life in which, you're facing political humiliation, if you will. And so there is an incentive to stick to power. But again, this isn't an autocratic government. You can't just stick to power through sheer force. There is rule of law, and he knows it. So he has to play around it. He has to see how he can survive. Are his allies still with him? The one thing that, I think he still has going for him is just the divided nature of the Israeli polity, the left-right divide. And I think that there are a lot of people, and he's hoping that October 7th has created an environment in which there are far more people who are willing to look the other way, if you will, to his transgressions and his legal problems and say, we need a strong prime minister. And so then the question becomes, can someone, a replacement, a successor, position himself as Mr. Security or, strong on security and gain the confidence of the electorate? We saw an op-ed to this effect from former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. And I read that as him sort of presenting himself as a voice of reason and balancing that with the need to project himself as the man who has the path forward or the solution or the future strategy for Israel's national security. So these are moving parts of the puzzle. So if someone can present themselves, and then there's the question of timing. When do people start to say, this war isn't ending? And it goes back to our earlier conversation about what does the end game look like, considering everything that is happening and the relative progress or the lack of progress, depending on how you're looking at it in the battle space. So when does Gaza become sort of secondary, or at least as equally important from a news point of view inside Israel as is the desire or the move to force Netanyahu out? So these are things we just need to watch.
What is going on with him and Biden? The president's been a longtime supporter of Israel, but his relationship to Netanyahu has been described as frosty until the October 7th attacks, after which he embraced them. The narrative being that he was doing that on purpose in order to give himself room to influence him into making certain compromises, maybe as a general effort to reduce the scope of Israeli reprisals and put some kind of two-state solution back on the table. What is the situation now? Because Biden's been talking openly about the need for such a solution, and Netanyahu's position is very different. But at the same time, he needs U.S. support. So how is he managing that relationship?
I think, it's becoming increasingly difficult for Netanyahu to manage that relationship. I think clearly Netanyahu knows that he needs American support. And if you start to differ in a significant way with the American president, then that's not good for you, especially not for your political imperatives, which is to stay in power. And I think that the more that Israelis begin to see that there's a disconnect between the White House and the Netanyahu government, then the more there will be this, if you will, urgency to say, hey, you need to step down, because not only did you try to undermine democracy before October 7th, October 7th happened because on your watch, because you were engaged in politics and you took your eye off the threat. And now you are undermining a relationship that is of strategic importance to the country. So I think that there are limits to what Netanyahu can do in terms of resisting Biden, because he can't go too far away from Washington or push back on Washington to where he makes people become uncomfortable. Israelis become uncomfortable and say, what are you doing with our most important relationship, which is the United States? And I think that gives Biden a lot of room to maneuver. And, look, if everybody's talking about a post-Netanyahu Israel, then you have to assume that the Biden White House is also thinking about that. It's not assuming that they're going to have to deal with Netanyahu for the long haul. And even though right now that's the person they need to deal with. And then, of course, there are institutional ties that are irrespective of who comes to power. And we know the lifespan of Israeli governments in recent history has been, very, very short. We've had how many elections in the last few years, and how many new prime ministers come, and new administrations, and new coalition governments? Washington knows that, but the relationship between the IDF and the Pentagon, the relationship between Mossad and the broader Israeli intelligence community and the CIA and the USIC will continue. And I think we're moving in a direction where dealing with the security issues, whether they're related to the war in Gaza, whether it's the Northern Front with Lebanon and extended to Syria, whether it's the Houthis, whatever that is, I think that will continue. And I think we'll see a separation where that continues, but we also see a disconnect between the prime minister in Israel, this prime minister, and it'll connect, somehow it'll intersect us with, whatever political change has to happen, because Washington has to be seeing that there is a growing movement to get Netanyahu to step down at some point. People have been waiting, saying, hey, now's not the right time. Now we need to put all our energies and all our focus on making sure that Hamas is removed from power in the Gaza Strip. But at some point, especially when that progress or the lack of progress that I've been talking about becomes very observable by everybody, then you say, okay, how long do we wait? And so I have to assume that Biden and his people are factoring that in.
How important is the pressure that Joe Biden is feeling in his own base? A big part of the Democratic Party, Democratic voters, especially young people, have not only been opposed to this war, but many of them have folded Israel into the larger culture wars and see them as a colonizer and see the Palestinians as oppressed peoples. And Biden's heading into an election in November. So, what do you know about how big of a deal this is in the Biden White House, how concerned they are about the effect that this war could have on the elections?
I mean, they have to be concerned. But before I get into that, I do want to point out something that you see a lot of criticism of the president, of Biden, that he is playing with fire as far as his own political future is concerned. This sort of reeks of sort of this mindset that thinks that ignores that we're dealing with a politician who's 80 years old. He's spent his lifetime in politics. He is not going to just, he knows how to do politics. He's not going to be reckless. On the contrary, he probably has his people keeping an eye on all the poll numbers and whatnot, constantly calculating, constantly seeing what can be done and what cannot be done. To what extent is he alienating, the more left wing of his Democratic Party? And yet he continues to balance. So there's a lot of criticism from the left that says, well, why aren't you calling for a ceasefire knowing that this could cost you the election? My response to that is, well, maybe he's not seeing a cost to his election. I'm not saying that's true. I'm just saying empathetic analysis teaches us that this is a seasoned politician. This is what he's done all his life, is to win elections and stay in power. He's a classic politician. He's not going to throw all of it away just because he has some, special affinity for Israel, or, I mean, people miscalculate. Look, I give you that. And I'm the first person to say miscalculations happen all the time. But this wouldn't be a miscalculation. This would be a blunder. And I just don't see Biden doing a blunder if it was that acute. In other words, what I'm trying to say is maybe from where he's calculating, maybe the numbers that he's getting, maybe the evidence that he's seeing about his popularity's decline is very different from how people are looking at it. I mean, obviously, a lot of these are politicized arguments. They're not analysis, if you will. And I'm trying to do analysis of politics, which is very hard, I admit. But I have to assume that he knows that if everyone is telling him, hey, you're going to lose the election, and then why isn't he budging? Obviously, there's something, we're missing something here. And he sees something that, or at least it's not as bad. I mean, and I'll throw something out. And this is pure speculation.
I love pure speculation.
Yeah, and
I love pure speculation.
And I have no idea if he's thinking this way. Look, I think that it's safe to say that Biden realizes he's alienated a lot of his base in this process of, how he has approached this war in Gaza. But at the same time, he's probably betting that the story will change once Trump emerges as the nominee on the other side. So you may not love me. You may think that I'm, not a good Democrat and I'm not as left as you would want me to be. But you certainly will not want to hand Trump the victory. So in other words, maybe he's thinking that these people will come around. A good chunk of these people will come around. Right now, this is the moment. This is in the heat of the moment. People are angry, frustrated. And, as you said, they've basically rolled the whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict into the big culture wars. But is this going to be the story down the road? We have to assume that he's working on this. And he knows that, I mean, look, I don't expect the White House to say, hey, guys, this war is not going to be around for another few months.
I think that is, from the people I've spoken with, that seems to be the strategy. The idea is that, sure, yeah, this looks bad, blah, blah, but we're running against Trump and he's going to alienate enough people and we're going to win. And that is a scary strategy. Maybe he's right. Maybe they're right. But even if it is true, man, is that a horrible way to run a country? Because we go through election after election now, especially in the last few, where it's just American people are like choosing between two candidates. They don't like either one of them. I mean, it's always kind of been the case, but it's just more so now. And I think we need much better. But that's just me, opining. So speaking of public opinion, we didn't talk about the opinion on the Arab Street. When the October 7th attacks happened, one of the things I noticed was that messaging coming out of Saudi Arabia, including not just officials, but also within the media. I had seen an interview that happened on Saudi state television. An anchor was grilling a leader of Hamas, some major...
The former head of Hamas, who's now part of their Politburo.
Right, and she was reprimanding him for those attacks and really kind of highlighting the brutality of it and saying, you knew the Israelis were going to respond. Kind of putting the responsibility on him where it absolutely belongs, because those attacks have led to what we have today. And again, this is in the context of Saudi-Israeli peace talks that could have produced some kind of solution that maybe it wasn't ideal, but it could have led to peaceful coexistence between the two countries. I don't know, but it certainly wouldn't have led to this. So what do we know now about, obviously the mood on the Arab Street has shifted substantially. It seems to have influenced also what officials in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, et cetera, can say or are willing to say. But you tell me, what is the mood and how has that influenced the messaging and the policy space for some of these kingdoms?
Again, with no actual data to go by, because we don't get polls in countries like Saudi Arabia that really can tell you what people are thinking and feeling.
We did see, though, massive demonstrations. We saw massive demonstrations in Turkey, in Egypt.
Yeah, I'm specifically referring to Saudi Arabia. In the absence of that, we just have to analyze a bit more harder or, use speculation, or circumstantial evidence. So, look, I think it's fair to say right now the street in the Middle East, the Arab world, the broader Muslim world, includes Turkey, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and you can sort of say even diaspora Muslim Arab communities in the West as well. The focus and the emotions are, well, look what's happening to the Palestinians, and this is horrendous. And they're right. They see it every day in real time. It's mind-boggling to imagine just the volume of social media sharings that might be taking place. There's no way to know, but you can imagine. I mean, I get my dose of it from my contacts. So then you aggregate everybody else and you say, what kind of public opinion is being formed and how are emotions and ideas shaped? So definitely that's the most important thing. But from the point of view of the elite, the ruling elite, especially countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, they have to look at other things as well. Where was Saudi Arabia before all of this began? It was negotiating with Israel. And the crown prince himself said that we're getting closer every day to a deal.
6 weeks, I believe he was on CNN or Fox, maybe it was. And he said we're 6 weeks away from a historic deal with Israel.
Yeah. So they were very close. There's now talk that once this is all in the rear view mirror, that those talks will be revived. Well, why is that the case? It's because there is something that is far bigger of a threat to the Arab world, to the security of Saudi Arabia and the broader region, which is Iran. And Iran's public opinion isn't looking at Iran, or, it's difficult to say how many people are, there's no poll say, what do you think is, more worse? Israeli bombardment of Gaza or what Iran is doing. So we don't have that data. But at some point, it's safe to assume that once the fighting in Gaza dies down and the news is flooded by events related to Israel. We're already seeing that, the sinking of the Houthi boats last Saturday or Sunday by the US Navy in the Red Sea, the assassination of the deputy leader of Hamas by Israel in Lebanon, this growing risk of confrontation between Hezbollah and Israel. And, today so we're recording this on Wednesday, January 3rd. I think were you about to talk about the terrorist attacks in Iran? Feel free, go ahead. Yeah, those attacks, which come as a complete surprise, considering the timing and considering the target set, the tomb of former IRGC Quds Force commander, Major General Qasem Soleimani, who was assassinated 4 years ago to the date by a U.S. airstrike in Iraq. And so you already see Iran and what Iran's role will become part of the public discourse. And I think that will become far more important, because that's just a news cycle where things rise in importance. I mean, are we talking about Ukraine at all anymore? Although if you ask me geopolitically, that's far more significant than what's happening in Gaza, because the future security of Europe, Russia's own future is at stake, and Eurasia in general, the future of Eurasia hinges on the outcome of the Ukraine war. So geopolitically, that's far more significant, but we're not talking about it. So the point that I'm making is that public opinion is shaped by news cycles and what's captivating the global audience. And so once those things become more important in the news cycle, and we've seen this happen, in the past, granted that this is a very different war than all previous Gaza wars. But if you go back to the moment in 2008, 2009, that war between Hamas and Israel, you go to the 2012 war, the 14th, the 2021. When you're in that moment, you think the public opinion and the outcry of the Arab street was laser focused on that. But as soon as the war ended, people moved on to other topics. And this isn't just particular to the Arab street. This is just general human nature. So I think that the thing that will be interesting to watch is what becomes of the confrontation with Iran. That confrontation is between Iran and the Arab states. That confrontation is between Israel and Iran. That confrontation is between the United States and Iran. And that confrontation is also between, although it gets very little coverage, between Turkey and Iran, because Turkey and Iran are historic rivals competing for influence in the region going back centuries. So I think that we just need to see what emerges out of it. And I think what will emerge, the Gaza war and the Palestinian issue isn't going to go away. It's just going to become low intensity. And I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow, but incrementally over the next several months. Iran and what has specifically happened with the Houthis. Until October 7, the Houthis were a Yemen versus Saudi, Yemen versus UAE thing. It was an Arabian Peninsula thing. And the most that the Houthis would do is launch drone attacks and ballistic missile attacks on Saudi, and occasionally, very rarely, against UAE. But because of the Saudi 7-year war between 2015 and 2022, that they were fighting the Houthis. This has really taken the Houthis to a geopolitical level. So it's no longer a regional kind of thing or a bilateral, trilateral kind of thing anymore. Messing with international shipping because you say that this is in solidarity with the Palestinians. Well, they're not the first, and they certainly won't be the last actor to use solidarity with X as an excuse to further their geopolitical interests. So it'll be interesting to see what the Houthis do, because they now had a taste of major league geopolitics. And Hezbollah in Lebanon is always a good benchmark to sort of say, okay, what other group can become what? So I'm, in my own sort of analysis, comparing and contrasting Ansar Allah, which is the formal name of the Houthis, with Hezbollah. And I just recently wrote a piece that I shared with you a few days ago on how I think that the Houthis, in many ways, are far more longer threat, if you will, than Hezbollah, or more potent threat on a more longer time horizon. Because Hezbollah has to worry about the vagaries of politics in Lebanon, because it's a confessional political system in which it has to worry about, Christian groups, Druze, Sunnis, and, so there are limits, there are constraints in which Hezbollah operates, which we see in Hezbollah. Basically, it's manifests in Hezbollah wanting not to have a fight with
Right. They've
Israel.
Been reluctant because public opinion doesn't want it. They don't want another war.
Exactly, especially with the terrible financial and economic situation that Lebanon is going through. In contrast, sharp contrast, the Houthis dominate Yemen, or at least parts of Yemen, most of Yemen that matters, or has historically mattered. They have no competitor. They defeated the Saudis in the war, in the sense that the Saudis were not able to impose a military solution. After, at least, I would say, 3, if not 4 years of a siege of the port of Hodeidah, the Saudis lifted the siege and gave up on it, and the Houthis basically consolidated the strategic port of Hodeidah, which is in the Bab el-Mandab in the Red Sea.
They control what, the north and northwest of Yemen? They don't control Aden, do they?
No, they don't. But that would be sort of their next goal at some point when, they have the opportunity. This is what they want to seize. But if you minus, Aden out of it, if you look at the historical maps of empires in this region, most major empires have never controlled the modern day full length and breadth of Yemen because it's a desert. What have they controlled? So, for example, the last great power or empire was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman controlled the part of Yemen that is currently under the Houthi control. And if you go back even further back in history, you see sort of the similar maps that you see that in terms of control of different dynasties. In fact, the predecessors, the Houthis represent the Zaydi sect, which is the Zaydis are an off-Shiite Islam. They have controlled the bulk of Yemen since the late 9th century. In fact, if you go back in history, from the mid-1600s to about the late 19th century, or the mid-19th century, the Ottomans lost control of Yemen to the Zaydis. They weren't the Houthis. The Houthis are a tribe. but they're now, the leaders of the Zaydis. But it goes to show how this area has always been geopolitically significant. So I'm going to be closely watching the Houthis, considering their very, very opportunistic and odd behavior. I honestly did not expect them to delve into sort of this maritime geopolitics of the Red Sea and the broader Arabian Sea. So they're gaining confidence, and that is worrying Saudi Arabia. And it's not just the Saudis. I mean, if they are able to, interdict shipping, if they remain a player in Yemen, this has implications for the Horn of Africa. This has implications for Egypt, the Suez Canal, for Israeli security, for Jordanian security, because of the port of Aqaba and the port of Eilat of Israel, and even the holy sites, Islam's holy sites of Mecca and Medina, because they're just north of the territory that the Houthis control in Yemen, in sort of a straight line in the Hijaz region, close to the hugging the Red Sea. And so I think that is going to become very, very significant. And then you overlay Iranian geopolitical interests, and you saw the report about them sort of sending a warship through the Red Sea. It was a symbolic move, but it's very telling of what Iranian intentions are. So Gaza will sort of taper off, but there's this broader conflict that's going to go on.
Well, which is why I brought you on the show, Kamran. I wanted to spend the first hour kind of tying a bow around what's going on between Israel and Gaza so we can get into the much larger stories. And we're certainly going to talk about the Houthis because not only are they central here, but also they're another example of groups that have affiliations with Iran. I mean, I think the Iranians, the IRGC was involved as early as in the early 90s with the Believing Youth movement. And the Houthis were modeled themselves also, I think, partly off of Hezbollah, which also has strong roots to Iran. And this to me is something that is still something that's not intuitive for me. In other words, trying to understand the paradigm of conflict in the Middle East in a way that isn't nation-state oriented, or rather not conventional in the way we think about it, so that, the Israelis are in some sense, and the Americans are in some sense, fighting a war with Iran. But the contours of that war, the way it looks, is not conventional. And that's very difficult to articulate when covering this story, so that it's hard for people to have that context, which is what we're going to try to create in the second hour. I also want to talk about what America's role in the Middle East is, because this continues to be an issue in American discourse, which is that many Americans continue to think about the U.S. role in the Middle East along the lines of what it had been in the early 2000s, which was like a nation-state building view. But I don't think that is anymore really what the Americans are trying to do. I don't think they're trying to export democracy. I think at this point, they're just trying to maintain stability. And how they can go about achieving that is something that we can also talk about the second hour. For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second hour of today's conversation with Kamran, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and sign up to one of our 3 content tiers. All subscribers gain access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the rest of today's conversation on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. Kamran, stick around. We're going to move the rest of our conversation onto the premium feed. If you want to listen in on the rest of today's conversation, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and join our premium feed. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, you can also do that through our subscriber page. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. You can follow me on Twitter at Kofinas, and you can email me at info@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.